Hi there, friends. So we're continuing to dig into 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and in a sense, the central point, the core part of that chapter, this time, verses 17 to 24. So really important for you to read verses 17 to 24, and then we'll summarize what this says. So pause the video now, read verses 17 to 24, and then we'll dig in. Paul has already addressed in this chapter various relationships between men and women. And with the discussion on divorce temporarily suspended at verse 16, Paul now lays out a principle that helps explain his perspective on marriage and divorce and singleness and widowhood. And this principle is one that should guide Christian men and women in the choices and actions in their relationships with each other. And it is summarized simply in verse 17. People should remain in the state in which they find themselves when God calls them to faith. That is, either as unmarried or married. Christians must see that any decision to change that status, either from married to unmarried or unmarried to married, should not be made on the assumption that one state is less or more spiritual than another. Rather, the fact that God has called them is critical. If Christians look at their lives in terms of having graciously been called by God to live as part of his holy people and enable them by his grace gifts to function, then his people will note the great benefits as the Lord leads us through our lives. And using two illustrations, one from the ritual of circumcision in verses 18 and 19, and one from the realm of slavery, you read about that in verses 21 to 23, Paul urges his readers 3 times to remain in the state in which they find themselves when they are called to faith. The centrality of this section, verses 17 to 24 in this chapter, and the whole argument of chapter 7 is specifically and specially notable when we recognize that the norm of remaining either single or married is frequently asserted. You'll see it in references throughout this chapter in verses 2 and 8 and 10 and 12, 26, 37, 40. It is just full of this point, this principle that Paul says that people should remain in the state in which they find themselves when God calls them. Now, the 2 illustrations, the one about circumcision and the one about slavery, seem far removed from the question of marriage. And he returns to that in verse 25. However, both of these demonstrate that Christians should not change their status for so-called spiritual reasons. Just as neither circumcision nor uncircumcision provides spiritual or religious merit before God, so neither does marriage or singleness. God's gracious call comes regardless of our social status. This does not mean that Christians cannot change their status. The slave can take advantage of the offer of freedom. He says that in verse 21. And therefore, the unmarried person can get married. But this is always done in recognition that the Lord does the leading. So let me just share my screen just for a very brief moment to show you where I'm getting this point and the structure of these verses. So there you have them. The principle is stated in full in verse 17, that each person should lead the life assigned by the Lord. There's that word assigned. And the social relationships at that point of God's call, whether single or married, ought to be maintained. The principle also concludes in verse 24, where the same thing is said. And therefore, there is what's called an inclusio here. There's a beginning and an end. There's an introduction and a conclusion to the one point that he is making. And that is that each person should lead the life assigned by the Lord. So some simple but crucial verses. And how do I summarize them? Well, like this: the Lord is now Lord, and life must be led according to his assignment and his will. Each person should lead the life that the Lord has appointed for them. Conversion is the critical point from which social relationships must now be viewed. So the Lord is now Lord, and life must be led according to his assignment and his will. So there we go. Simple, challenging. Of course, this is God's word to us. That's this video. Join me on the next one as we conclude the remaining verses of chapter 7. See you then.